In late August of 1897, Theodor Herzl officiated the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. While the Zionist movement had predated the Congress by well over a decade, and Herzl's personal vision for that movement was largely out of touch with his fellow Zionists, the Congress nevertheless marked a significant advance towards a political program of Jewish nationhood. But it wasn't the only one. Just 5 weeks later, in another similarly sized European city, another group of Jewish activists gathered to establish their own national political program. This was a much smaller meeting than the Zionist Congress. Instead of over 200 delegates, this Congress had just 13. But in the decades to come, Bundism would become just as popular and influential as Zionism, albeit not forever. Today, the ideology of Bundism isn't just extinct, but it's been extinct for longer than it was ever around. And this has caused some confusion. If you hang out in certain very online Jewish spaces, you'll probably know the term Bundist mainly as a casual insult towards Jewish anti-Zionists or anyone accused of assimilating. But Bundists were not assimilationists. They were Jewish nationalists just as much as Zionists were Jewish nationalists. At the same time, Bundism has been extinct for so long that it also tends to be sentimentalized and mythologized into something much stranger than it actually was. You'll sometimes hear it described as a Jewish nationalism that rejected land, borders, or government. But that isn't actually true. Bundism was merely the synthesis of two other movements that had already developed over the course of the late 19th century. So let's talk about those. Socialism originated in France and quickly took root among many former liberals in post-Napoleonic Western Europe. I've talked about this some in a previous video, so I'd advise you to watch that first if you haven't already. By far the most remembered of these early socialists are Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who advocated for a more radical form of socialism that rejected popular concepts of liberalism and nationalism almost entirely in favor of a rigid theory of history which viewed what they called communism as the inevitable outcome of any advanced society. But that was pretty controversial, even within the socialist movement. The revolutions of 1848 in particular opened a huge rift between Marx and Engels and many of their contemporaries. Figures like Giuseppe Mazzini, Ferdinand Lassalle, and Moses Hess found far more success incorporating elements of liberalism and nationalism into their platforms and working with other movements to achieve pragmatic policy goals like pensions, healthcare, and unionization, solidifying a distinction between socialists and social democrats that persists to this day. Lassalle even became an ally to the famously conservative Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and strongly influenced Bismarck's social policies in the newly unified Germany. By contrast, socialists in France held themselves back for decades with a stubborn refusal to participate in coalition governments or even engage with many of the salient issues of the day. Only in the wake of the Dreyfus Affair did the majority of French socialists abandon this strategy and enter the political mainstream. Meanwhile, socialist ideas were extremely slow to reach the Russian Empire, and for good reason. Russia was an extremely centralized absolute monarchy with no place for electoral politics on the national level. By the 1870s, an assortment of populist organizations with some socialist elements had emerged, but without a formal political structure in which to operate, they were quick to resort to violence and were easily suppressed. There was also the economic issue. Even by the end of the 19th century, 87% of Russian subjects still lived on farms or in nomadic communities, enjoying a way of life that had hardly changed in centuries. In due time, other left-wing movements like the Social Revolutionaries and Trudovics would embrace agrarian politics and become more successful than anyone in this video. But in the 1880s, even in Russia, socialism remained almost entirely concerned with the social position of industrial workers in cities. Now, Russia did have some industry and urbanization, but it was mainly located on the western fringe of the empire, beyond the Russian heartland in places that had been conquered from Poland and the Ottoman Empire a century earlier, and which were home to distinctly non-Russian cultures. So when socialism did finally reach the empire, it was dominated by an unlikely coalition of dissidents from the Russian upper class, not exactly Marx's idea of the proletariat, and educated intellectuals from non-Russian minorities, Though established from exile in Switzerland, Russia's very first socialist organization, the Emancipation of Labor Group, perfectly encapsulated this unlikely alliance through its founders, which included both the Tatar aristocrat Georgy Plekhanov and Pavel Axelrod, a Jewish man who'd grown up in extreme poverty. Don't be mistaken. Despite coming from uncommonly diverse backgrounds, these early Russian socialists were not multiculturalists. They were assimilationist and assimilated, the very models of Russification. And even as they opposed Russian autocracy, they continued to embrace that cultural worldview. Of course, that couldn't last forever. The Russian Empire was a big place with lots of people. And under the exceptionally repressive regime of Emperor Alexander III, it had experienced an explosion of clandestine political movements, from liberals to anarchists to ultranationalist reactionaries. And in the industrial cities of the West, that kind of ideological diversity existed within and across every demographic. While most of Russia's Jewish population was still yet to become politically active, popular notions of emigration, assimilation, religious reaction, liberalism, and socialism were omnipresent and perpetually clashing. For a time, the Black Sea port of Odessa had served as the uncontested epicenter of that clash. But by the 1880s, a new intellectual center had risen at the opposite end of the Pale of Settlement. Prior to its annexation by Russia in the 1790s, Vilna had been the historic capital of Lithuania, and a major center for Jewish culture and thought. Famously, it had been home to the Vilna Gaon, who rallied traditionalists against Hasidic Judaism and solidified the city's position as a center of education, and notably a much more traditional type of education than one would find in Odessa. Under the policies of Russification, it had become home to one of the Pale's only 2 rabbinic seminaries, and for a time it had also been one of only 2 cities where publishing in Hebrew or Yiddish had been allowed. In the 1880s, Vilna's status as the center of Yiddish language publishing took on renewed significance as many Jewish artists came to embrace their formerly scorned language. As a result, Vilna developed a reputation as a refuge for so-called useful Jews who had previously held the right to live outside the Pale of Settlement, only to lose that right as punishment for their political activism. And by the 1890s, those exiles of the socialist persuasion had coalesced into the tiny but enthusiastic Vilna group, led by Arkady Kramer. A native of the Vilna region, Kramer returned to his hometown in 1890 following his arrest and expulsion from the Technological Institute in St. Petersburg. Though the members of the Vilna group at this time could be counted in single digits, Kramer was quick to find them and immediately stood out as the true leader and organizer of the movement. A humble man of no great charisma, he was nevertheless extremely eager and hardworking, with a talent for the practical work of advertising and recruiting. Initially, Kramer had no interest whatsoever in Jewish politics. Like everyone else in the Vilna group, he was a Russified assimilationist who viewed socialism as a permanent escape from antiquated notions of ethnic and religious affiliation. But the demographic and economic realities of the empire quickly cast doubt on that attitude. Generally speaking, the working-class Jews, Poles, and Lithuanians of Vilna were decidedly not fans of Russian culture. And having grown up in that cultural environment, Kramer was exceptionally willing to embrace that reality, and possessed both the credibility and the tenacity to drag the rest of the Vilna group along with him. In 1893, he published a pamphlet criticizing the socialist movement for being too intellectual and overly concerned with ideological purity when it should be engaging with real-life issues and actually appealing to the masses that it claimed to represent. Under this reasoning, Yiddish replaced Russian as the primary language of the Vilna group. Remember when I said that only a small minority of Russian subjects lived in cities? Well, about half the empire's Jews lived in cities, and due to a century of legal restrictions, they were even more concentrated in just a handful of those. Some cities were even majority Jewish. Despite almost a century of Russification, almost no working-class Jews spoke Russian, so the switch to Yiddish was actually a practical decision. But by 1895, it began to take on a more pointed significance with the arrival of Kramer's fellow St. Petersburg exile, Yuli Martov. In 1895, Martov delivered a speech to the Vilna group titled On Agitation. Whereas Kramer had embraced Yiddish as a means to meet the working class where they were, Martov emphasized the need for Jewish workers to recognize specific challenges to their own community, not only as workers, but as Jews. He feared that a socialism which failed to address inequalities beyond pure economics could be used to perpetuate bigotry and imperialism, and as a result called for the establishment of a dedicated workers' organization to agitate for Jewish emancipation alongside proletarian revolution. Despite Martov's words, his path would ultimately diverge wildly from that of the Vilna Group. Just a few months after his speech, his exile in Vilnius ended, allowing him to return to St. Petersburg and form a fast friendship with fellow dissident Vladimir Ulyanov. While Martov actively encouraged a grassroots Jewish socialist movement, he adamantly opposed the Vilna Group's focus on pragmatic reforms like unionization, pensions, and rights to healthcare and education. Strange as it may sound today, Martov and Ulyanov viewed these goals as antithetical to socialism on the grounds that merely securing better economic conditions for the working class would only serve to discourage them from organizing internationally for a truly transformative political revolution. This uncommonly absolutist approach to socialism bound them together, and by the end of the year they had formed their own socialist party, the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class. Nevertheless, Martov's arguments inspired the Vilna Group to embrace yet another nascent movement of the time, autonomism. Back in the 1870s, the Hebraist and later Zionist Peretz Smolenskin had argued that Jewish nationhood was simply a reality of life, and that it existed independently of both religion and landedness. Religious orthodoxy, Smolenskin argued, had merely attempted to monopolize that sense of nationhood, while assimilationists had tried and failed to negate it. Anticipating the ideas of Achad Ha'am a couple decades later, Smolenskin argued that even without returning to the homeland, that nation was capable of surviving and thriving through the adoption of a secular Hebrew-speaking culture that could be modern and progressive without abandoning traditional identity. Smolenskin died in 1885, aged just 42, but his ideas would explicitly be applied to politics 8 years later when several local Jewish politicians from the Romanian-speaking region of Bukovina in Austria formed the Jewish National Party. Now, the 1890s were a golden age of autonomism all around. By far the most high-profile autonomous movement of the time was the Irish Parliamentary Party, with their platform of home rule. But unquestionably the epicenter of autonomist politics was Austria, where almost all political parties were divided along ethnic lines. Up to that point, Austrian Jews had been content to participate in German, Polish, Ukrainian, Czech, Romanian, or Italian parties. And that didn't entirely stop, but the Jewish National Party opened up an entirely new possibility: the full recognition of Jews as a constituent nation of the Austrian state, even if that nation lacked a distinct territory to call its own. This model of politics understandably appealed to the far more marginalized communities of the neighboring Russian Empire, and most importantly for our purposes, it offered a path forward for Arkady Kramer and the Vilna Group. Initially, Kramer was reluctant to do anything more than continue his existing work of organizing Jewish workers in a few major cities. But his efforts weren't getting much support from the original Emancipation of Labor group over in Switzerland, mainly due to the objections of Georgy Plekhanov, who, despite co-founding the group with the Jewish Pavel Axelrod, was otherwise a raging anti-Semite with a broad disdain for overt expressions of Jewish identity, language, or politics to a degree that even the non-Jewish Ulyanov found shockingly offensive. This lack of support from higher-ups finally convinced Kramer of the need for a specifically Jewish party. So on the 7th of October 1897, 13 delegates from Vilna, Warsaw, Bialystok, Minsk, and Vitebsk gathered to form the General Jewish Labor Bund. A year later, John Mill of Warsaw became editor of the previously nonpartisan magazine Der Jiddischer Arbeiter and turned it into the primary mouthpiece of the Bund, though he made sure to include perspectives from other allies, like the leader of the Polish-Lithuanian Social Democrats, Rosa Luxemburg. Incidentally, because I know you're wondering, John Mill was born Josef Shlomo Mill, but probably took on the English name John as a tribute to the British philosopher and politician John Stuart Mill. As you may have guessed from the existence of the Polish-Lithuanian Social Democrats, the Bund was far from alone in being both socialist and autonomist. But there were some notable elements separating it from other socialist and autonomist organizations. Firstly, the Bund was one of the few socialist groups anywhere that was actually run by blue-collar industrial workers instead of academics. Of the 13 founding members of the Bund, 8 worked as artisans or factory workers. Secondly, despite being a specifically Jewish interest party, the Bund was initially much more popular than the League of Struggle. So despite their disparate paths, the League under Martov worked to maintain good relations with the Bund and benefit from their success, culminating in 1898, when representatives of the League, Emancipation of Labor, and the Bund gathered at a secret meeting in Minsk to form the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Despite this ostensible unification, the Bund continued to operate as a separate entity, with distinct ideological differences and political strategies. It's a model that was soon adopted by other autonomist groups that later joined the party, and that's a testament to the Bund's early success. But with that success came new thinkers, new ideas, and an increasingly rigid sense of political identity. Vladimir Medem was born in 1879 to a Jewish family from Latvia that had converted to Lutheranism when he was very young. In late 1897, the same time that the Bund was being established in Vilna, Medem began studying at the University of Kiev, but was, say it with me, expelled for his participation in socialist politics. Washing up in the majority Jewish city of Minsk, Medem continued his political work, but became increasingly fascinated by his own Jewish heritage. Coming from a family that had forcefully rejected Judaism in the hope of a better social status, things like the Yiddish language and even the Hebrew Bible had been strictly off-limits. But now, it was all available for him to explore. I dare say he developed an unhealthy obsession with it, particularly when it came to Yiddish. Though Yiddish had always been a popular spoken language, the 1880s and 90s had elevated it to prominence as a respectable literary language, centered around publishing in Vilna and theater in Odessa. While Hebrew had always been the language of Jewish law and religious practice, fluency in the language had been almost entirely limited to educated middle-class men. So while the flourishing of Yiddish had begun as a practicality, it quickly took on a political connotation as the language of class struggle within the Jewish community, which was only reinforced by its adoption as the language of the Bund. Not being a religious man to begin with, Medem never officially reverted to Judaism. But when he was arrested in 1901 for his involvement with a local chapter of the Bund, he didn't hesitate to identify himself to the police as a Jew. While Arkady Kramer continued on as the Bund's chief organizer, Medem quickly rose to become its chief philosopher. And it was Medem who solidified the identity of the Bund as an organization against clericalism, against assimilation, and against Zionism. In April 1901, the Bund, under Medem's influence, adopted an official position rejecting the establishment of a Jewish state and the revival of the Hebrew language. To many, this was a shocking development. The Bund, like virtually all Jewish autonomist movements at the time, had a lot of Hebraist and Zionist members. But Medem and his allies were deeply fearful of the Zionist movement, since every Jew who moved to Palestine was also one less supporter for the Bund. At least that was the theory. The Zionist minority certainly didn't see any contradiction between the class struggle in Russia and the class struggle in Palestine. After all, wasn't class struggle a global phenomenon? In protest, the Zionist faction resigned from the Bund and formed the Zionist Socialist Workers' Union, led by a 19-year-old self-taught Marxist theoretician named Ber Borochov. This isn't important right now, but remember that name. Mind you, all of these factions were very much still underground movements. Throughout the events of this video, most of the people I've mentioned spent some time under arrest, hiding abroad, or exiled to Siberia. But it hardly made a difference. Both the Bund and socialism in general continued growing on the Russian street. And with the Zionist faction gone, the Bund was finally able to formulate a succinct, coherent platform to present to the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. The Bund is the social democratic organization of the Jewish proletariat, enters the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party as its sole representative, and is not subject to any geographical restriction. This was some strong stuff, And recent events within the empire, which I'll have to save for another video, left Kramer and Medem even more confident that their partners in the RSDLP would have to face facts and embrace the notion of an autonomous Jewish nation within the future post-revolutionary Russia. They were wrong. By 1903, the landscape of Russian socialism had changed irrevocably. Though still comparatively tiny, numbering fewer than 10,000 members in total, the autonomist factions had become a tiny minority in comparison to the League of Struggle, which was now so dominant that it had begun developing its own factions within factions. It was during the Congress that the divisions were laid bare, transforming Ulyanov and Martov from friends into bitter enemies. Officially, the divide began over the management of the party's official newspaper, Iskra. But that issue quickly revealed itself as a mere proxy for a much larger debate over the nature of the RSDLP as a whole. Most immediately, Martov was frustrated with Ulyanov's vision of party leadership. Martov was emphatic about the need for collective decision-making, and wanted to include as many people from the working class of the empire as possible. Ulyanov, who had since adopted the new name Lenin, favored leadership by a small core of dedicated intellectuals who could then activate the working class at large, a concept later known as vanguardism. Not coincidentally, the vast majority of Lenin's supporters in the matter were ethnic Russians, including a surprisingly large number of middle-class gentry and aristocrats. When it came to longer-term issues, Lenin believed that the Russian Empire could fully transition to communism at any time. Martov didn't. Serfdom may have ended officially decades earlier, but the vast majority of imperial subjects still lived on farms under a continued feudal regime, and Martov believed that Russia couldn't become communist without first becoming capitalist. This fundamental debate loomed over the entire Congress, with almost every subsequent vote acting as a proxy fight between Lenin and Martov. The lone exception centered around the Bund. In most of the votes, the Bund had sided with Martov. But Martov didn't respond in kind, and it would prove his undoing. Towards the end of the Congress, the Bund called to be recognized as the sole representative of the Jewish proletariat in the Russian Empire, but received no support whatsoever. The motion was defeated 41-5 with 5 abstentions. In protest, Kramer and Medem led the Bund out of the Congress and announced their permanent withdrawal from the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Deprived of their support, Martov lost his majority to Lenin, and while the ideological battle between them wasn't over, it was ultimately Lenin and his majority, or in Russian, Bolsheviks, who would dominate and overpower Martov and his minority, or Mensheviks. But the Bund? The Bund was doing just fine. For the next several decades, it would only grow larger, even finding success outside the Russian Empire. Eventually, it would rise in prominence to become every bit the equal of Zionism. But this was only the beginning, and Bundism's rise and fall is something best saved for many stories to come. Special thanks to my patrons, including Matthew Von Abo, Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Jay Fleischman, Oshel Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Eric Liederman, and Chris Nelson.